Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Meantime, what about Speaker Mike Johnson, who is going to be up for another speakership vote on January 3rd? Real questions about whether he can muster a majority to keep that gavel. The Republican House majority is going to be even narrower, if you can believe it, next year. Some reports I'm reading, doing the calculating, suggesting that Johnson could maybe lose only one Republican if all Democrats show up and vote against him and retain the speakership. Notably, amid this funding fight last week, one Republican said that he would not vote for Speaker Johnson again. That is Kentucky Republican Thomas Massie, saying that I'll vote for somebody else. I've got a few in mind. I'm not going to say yet. As far as I know, nobody yet has decided to mount a formal challenge to Speaker Johnson. But Kim, are we potentially going into another confusing speaker battle where it's not clear who can get a majority, and maybe the answer for some weeks or days is nobody?
Well, I would note that some of the chaos that we saw this last week was that uncertainty over Mike Johnson's future, in that when he was drafting that initial bill, he was attempting to do so in a way that could get it across the finish line, but not do so in a way that outright provoked a lot of those more House Freedom Caucus members who have been skeptical of his speakership in the past. It was pretty clear a bill was going to pass that they did not like, but he was attempting to do so in a way that maintained bridges there. And this is some of the kind of unspoken secret in Washington over the past couple of months, which is that if he can simply get through January 3rd, he likely will have a lot more flexibility, not necessarily in passing legislation. He's still going to need every one of those votes, but he won't have to move every day worried that he's going to lose his job. Because I would note as well that another thing that's at least envisioned as part of the new House package of rules is that they're going to raise the threshold for the number of members you would need to call for a motion to vacate the chair. So, this was what was the cause of Kevin McCarthy losing his speakership. Matt Gaetz and others piled on, and that threshold had been set very low. In theory, the new rules package will make it harder for that to happen. So if he can simply get across the line on January 3rd, he should have some more maneuvering room. One big unknown here is Donald Trump, who at least publicly and at times where it has mattered more has expressed support for Mike Johnson's speakership, but he's been quiet now. Is he going to attempt to step in there and throw his weight around in that space as well? I'm hoping that one of the things that people are telling him is there is not a natural replacement for Mike Johnson. When you have the margins that you mentioned, Kyle, anybody else who wants to come in is also going to have the support of pretty much the unanimous caucus. And right now, there really isn't anyone. I mean, especially if Johnson were ousted, there'd be a lot of bruised feelings on that, which would mean any replacement would find it that much harder to get some of those votes. That's exactly what we saw in the Kevin McCarthy fight. And at that point, Republicans had a bigger majority than they're going to have next year. So this, I think, is that huge question on January 3rd. He can lose Massie if there are any more House Freedom Caucus members who come out and on principle say no. And then you get into the question as if Donald Trump does weigh in and he weighs in favor of Johnson, does he then exert his pressure to get the rest of members to fall in line?
In my view, Johnson has done a pretty good job since becoming speaker, and to Kim's point here, might be one of the few people who can bridge this divide in that he has conservative credibility. I don't think there are real doubts that he is a conservative at heart, that he would like to go further than his current majority allows him to, get spending under control, just to pick one issue. But he's also a realist in that he knows, sitting in the leadership office, that his options, if he has a majority of one or two seats, are to pass something that all Republicans will vote for, but he knows he has this rump of Republicans who say they won't vote for any continuing resolution, for example, or to pass something that some Democrats will vote for, which will be which will necessarily mean there are less conservative policies in it, or to blunder into some kind of shutdown. And Monet will give you the last word, but that is the constant difficulty, it seems to me, is that it is easy to be on the back benches, as they say in UK politics, and throw peanuts at the guy who is trying to keep the government open so that his party doesn't get blamed for some kind of shutdown that doesn't pay members of the military over Christmas. And it is much harder to be sitting there in the speaker's office actually trying to figure out which kind of a bill can advance some conservative priorities while still getting enough votes to get over the finish line.
I think you just described the core irony, which is that the members of the House Republican caucus who say that they're most opposed to the deals that Mike Johnson has cut are the ones who are the most responsible for the fact that he has to constantly rely on Democratic support to get these funding bills across the line, because they refuse to sign on to any type of agreement so that they would be able to pass something just with Republican votes. And then they could go into conference with Chuck Schumer and Senate Republicans, with President Biden, and figure out how are we going to amend this so that we can finally agree on getting something passed. I think that one of the greatest successes of the current Congress came during Kevin McCarthy's speakership, actually, when they were negotiating over the debt ceiling deal. It certainly wasn't a perfect agreement. In fact, it restrained the growth of defense spending, and that's a problem that Republicans are now having to try to make up for in the coming Congress. But it did get work requirements attached to food stamps. It did get billions of dollars clawed back from some of the funding that Democrats gave to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act. And they were able to do that because it was one of the only major spending bills when Republicans got together and presented a united front. And rather than having Republican abstentions and having to force Kevin McCarthy to reach across the aisle, and there's no way that House Democrats would have allowed some of those positive provisions to make it into the deal in the first place. And so I think that the way forward for House Republicans is for some of the quote unquote fiscal hawks to do some soul searching, realize where their power actually comes from, and the approach that's going to maximize the Republican advantage. And that's going to be being willing to actually cooperate with leadership and put a united front forward. So I'm not optimistic about that happening. That definitely would be the best way for Republicans to be able to exert as much leverage as they possibly can in the Congress.
Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back later this week with another edition of Potomac Watch.